The Story of Civilization, Volume 1, Our Oriental Heritage, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 5, Side 1. When the great Corsican led a French expedition to Egypt in 1798, he took with him a number of draftsmen and engineers to explore and map the terrain, and made place also for certain scholars absurdly interested in Egypt for the sake of a better understanding of history. It was this corps of men who first revealed the temples of Luxor and Karnak to the modern world, and the elaborate Description de l'Égypte, 1809 to 1813, which they prepared for the French Academy, was the first milestone in the scientific study of this forgotten civilization. For many years, however, they were unable to read the inscriptions surviving on the monuments. Typical of the scientific temperament was the patient devotion with which Champollion, one of these savants, applied himself to the decipherment of the hieroglyphics. He found at last an obelisk covered with such sacred carvings in Egyptian, but bearing at the base a Greek inscription which indicated that the writing concerned Ptolemy and Cleopatra. Guessing that two hieroglyphics often repeated with a royal cartouche attached were the names of these rulers, he made out tentatively, 1822, 11 Egyptian letters. This was the first proof that Egypt had had an alphabet. Then he applied this alphabet to a great black stone slab that Napoleon's troops had stumbled upon near the Rosetta mouth of the Nile. This Rosetta stone contained an inscription in 3 languages, first in hieroglyphics, second in Demotic, the popular script of the Egyptians, and third in Greek. With his knowledge of Greek and the 11 letters made out from the obelisk, Champollion, after more than 20 years of labor, deciphered the whole inscription, discovered the entire Egyptian alphabet, and opened the way to the recovery of a lost world. It was one of the peaks in the history of history. 2. Prehistoric Egypt, Paleolithic, Neolithic, the Badarians, Pre-dynastic, Race. Since the radicals of one age are the reactionaries of the next, it was not to be expected that the men who created Egyptology should be the first to accept as authentic the remains of Egypt's Old Stone Age. After 40, les savants ne sont pas curieux. When the first flints were unearthed in the valley of the Nile, Sir Flinders Petrie, not usually hesitant with figures, classed them as the work of post-dynastic generations, and Maspero, whose lordly erudition did no hurt to his urbane and polished style, ascribed Neolithic Egyptian pottery to the Middle Kingdom. Nevertheless, in 1895 De Morgan revealed an almost continuous gradation of Paleolithic cultures, corresponding substantially with their succession in Europe, in the flint hand-axes, harpoons, arrowheads, and hammers exhumed all along the Nile. Imperceptibly, the Paleolithic remains graduate into Neolithic at depths indicating an age 10,000 to 4,000 B.C. The stone tools became more refined and reach indeed a level of sharpness, finish, and precision unequaled by any other Neolithic culture known. Towards the end of the period, metalwork enters in the form of vases, chisels, and pins of copper, and ornaments of silver and gold. Finally, as a transition to history, agriculture appears. In the year 1901, near the little town of Badari, halfway between Cairo and Karnak, bodies were excavated amid implements indicating a date approximating to 40 centuries before Christ. In the intestines of these bodies, preserved through 6 millenniums by the dry heat of the sand, were husks of unconsumed barley. Since barley does not grow wild in Egypt, it is presumed that the Badarians had learned to cultivate cereals. From that early age, the inhabitants of the Nile Valley began the work of irrigation, cleared the jungles and the swamps, won the river from the crocodile and the hippopotamus, and slowly laid the groundwork of civilization. These and other remains give us some inkling of Egyptian life before the first of the historic dynasties. It was a culture midway between hunting and agriculture, and just beginning to replace stone with metal tools. The people made boats, ground corn, wove linen and carpets, had jewels and perfumes, barbers and domesticated animals, and delighted to draw pictures, chiefly of the prey they pursued. They painted upon their simple pottery figures of mourning women, representations of animals and men, and geometrical designs. And they carved such excellent products as the Gabel el-Arak knife. They had pictographic writing and Sumerian-like cylinder seals. No one knows whence these early Egyptians came. Learned guesses inclined to the view that they were a cross between Nubian, Ethiopian, and Libyan natives on one side, and Semitic or Armenoid immigrants on the other. Even at that date there were no pure races on the earth. Probably the invaders or immigrants from Western Asia brought a higher culture with them, and their intermarriage with the vigorous native stocks provided that ethnic blend which is often the prelude to a new civilization. Slowly, from 4000 to 3000 BC, these mingling groups became a people and created the Egypt of history. 3. The Old Kingdom. The Nomes, the first historic individual, Cheops, Khephren, the purpose of the pyramids, art of the tombs, mummification. Already, by 4000 BC, these peoples of the Nile had forged a form of government. The population along the river was divided into nomes, in each of which the inhabitants were essentially of one stock, acknowledged the same totem, obeyed the same chief, and worshipped the same gods by the same rites. Throughout the history of ancient Egypt, these nomes persisted, their nomarchs, or rulers, having more or less power and autonomy according to the weakness or strength of the reigning pharaoh. As all developing structures tend toward an increasing interdependence of the parts, so in this case the growth of trade and the rising costliness of war forced the nomes to organize themselves into two kingdoms, one in the south, one in the north, a division probably reflecting the conflict between African natives and Asiatic immigrants. This dangerous accentuation of geographic and ethnic differences was resolved for a time when Menes, a half-legendary figure, brought the two lands under his united power, promulgated a body of laws given him by the god Thoth, established the first historic dynasty, built a new capital at Memphis, taught the people, in the words of an ancient Greek historian, to use tables and couches, and introduced luxury and an extravagant manner of life. The first real person in known history is not a conqueror or a king, but an artist and a scientist, Imhotep, physician, architect, and chief advisor of King Zoser, circa 3150 BC. He did so much for Egyptian medicine that later generations worshipped him as a god of knowledge, author of their sciences and their arts, and at the same time he appears to have founded the school of architecture, which provided the next dynasty with the first great builders in history. It was under his administration, according to Egyptian tradition, that the first stone house was built. It was he who planned the oldest Egyptian structure extant, the step pyramid of Saqqara, a terraced structure of stone which for centuries set the style in tombs. And apparently it was he who designed the funerary temple of Zoser, with its lovely lotus columns and its limestone-paneled walls. In these old remains at Saqqara, at what is almost the beginning of historic Egyptian art, we find fluted shafts as fair as any that Greece would build, reliefs full of realism and vitality, green faience, richly colored glazed earthenware, rivaling the products of medieval Italy, and a powerful stone figure of King Zoser himself, obscured in its details by the blows of time, but still revealing an astonishingly subtle and sophisticated face. We do not know what concourse of circumstances made the Fourth Dynasty the most important in Egyptian history before the 18th. Perhaps it was the lucrative mining operations in the last reign of the Third, perhaps the ascendancy of Egyptian merchants in Mediterranean trade, perhaps the brutal energy of Khufu, the Cheops of Herodotus, who reigned from 3098 to 3075 BC, first pharaoh of the new house. Herodotus has passed on to us the traditions of the Egyptian priests concerning this builder of the first of Giza's pyramids. Now they tell me that to the reign of Rhampsinitus there was a perfect distribution of justice, and that all Egypt was in a high state of prosperity, but that after him Cheops, coming to reign over them, plunged into every kind of wickedness, for that, having shut up all the temples, he ordered all the Egyptians to work for himself. Some, accordingly, were appointed to draw stones from the quarries in the Arabian mountains down the Nile. Others he ordered to receive the stones when transported in vessels across the river. And they worked to the number of 100,000 men at a time, each party during 3 months. The time during which the people were thus harassed by toil lasted 10 years on the road which they constructed and along which they drew the stones, a work, in my opinion, not much less than the pyramid. Of his successor and rival builder, Khafre, the Khephren of Herodotus, who ruled from 3067 to 3011 BC, we know something almost at first hand, for the diorite portrait which is among the treasures of the Cairo Museum pictures him, if not as he looked, certainly as we might conceive this pharaoh of the second pyramid, who ruled Egypt for 56 years. On his head is the falcon, symbol of the royal power. But even without that sign, we should know that he was every inch a king. Proud, direct, fearless, piercing eyes, a powerful nose, and a frame of reserved and quiet strength. It is evident that nature had long since learned how to make men, and art had long since learned how to represent them. Why did these men build pyramids? Their purpose was not architectural, but religious. The pyramids were tombs, lineally descended from the most primitive of burial mounds. Apparently the pharaoh believed, like any commoner among his people, that every living body was inhabited by a double, or ka, which need not die with the breath, and that the ka would survive all the more completely if the flesh were preserved against hunger, violence, and decay. The pyramid, by its height, its form, and its position, sought stability as a means to deathlessness, and except for its square corners, it took the natural form that any homogeneous group of solids would take if allowed to fall unimpeded to earth. Again, it was to have permanence and strength. Therefore stones were piled up here with mad patience, as if they had grown by the wayside and had not been carried from quarries hundreds of miles away. In Khufu's pyramid there are 2.5 million blocks, some of them weighing 150 tons, all of them averaging 2.5 tons. They cover 500,000 square feet and rise 481 feet into the air, and the mass is solid. Only a few blocks were omitted to leave a secret passageway for the carcass of the king. A guide leads the trembling visitor on all fours into the cavernous mausoleum, up 100 crouching steps to the very heart of the pyramid. There in the damp, still center, buried in darkness and secrecy, once rested the bones of Khufu and his queen. The marble sarcophagus of the pharaoh is still in place, but broken and empty. Even these stones could not deter human thievery, nor all the curses of the gods. Since the ka was conceived as the minute image of the body, it had to be fed, clothed, and served after the death of the frame. Lavatories were provided in some royal tombs for the convenience of the departed soul, and a funerary text expresses some anxiety lest the ka, for want of food, should feed upon its own excreta. One expects the Egyptian burial customs, if traced to their source, would lead to the primitive interment of a warrior's weapons with his corpse, or some institution like the Hindu sati, the burial of a man's wives and slaves with him that they may attend to his needs. This having proved irksome to the wives and slaves, painters and sculptors were engaged to draw pictures, carve bas-reliefs, and make statuettes resembling these aids. By a magic formula usually inscribed upon them, the carving or painted objects would be quite as effective as the real ones. A man's descendants were inclined to be lazy and economical, and even if he had left an endowment to cover the costs, they were apt to neglect the rule that religion originally put upon them of supplying the dead with provender. Hence, pictorial substitutes were in any case a wise precaution. They could provide the ka of the deceased with fertile fields, plump oxen, innumerable servants, and busy artisans at an attractively reduced rate. Having discovered this principle, the artist accomplished marvels with it. One tomb picture shows a field being plowed, the next shows the grain being reaped or threshed, another the bread being baked. One shows the bull copulating with the cow, another the calf being born, another the grown cattle being slaughtered, another the meat served hot on the dish. A fine limestone bas-relief in the tomb of Prince Rahotep portrays the dead man enjoying the varied victuals on the table before him. Never since has art done so much for men. Finally, the ka was assured long life not only by burying the cadaver in a sarcophagus of the hardest stone, but by treating it to the most painstaking mummification. So well was this done that to this day bits of hair and flesh cling to the royal skeletons. Herodotus vividly describes the Egyptian embalmer's art. First they draw out the brains through the nostrils with an iron hook, raking part of it out in this manner, the rest by the infusion of drugs. Then with a sharp stone they make an incision in the side and take out all the bowels, and having cleansed the abdomen and rinsed it with palm wine, they next sprinkle it with pounded perfume. Then, having filled the belly with pure myrrh, cassia, and other perfumes, they sew it up again. And when they have done this, they steep it in natron, leaving it under for 70 days. For a longer time than this it is not lawful to steep it. Natron is a silicate of sodium and aluminum. At the expiration of 70 days they wash the corpse and wrap the whole body in bandages of waxen cloth, smearing it with gum, which the Egyptians commonly use instead of glue. After this the relations, having taken the body back again, make a wooden case in the shape of a man, and having made it they enclose the body, and then having fastened it up, they store it in a sepulchral chamber, setting it upright against the wall. In this manner they prepare the bodies that are embalmed in the most expensive way. All the world fears time, says an Arab proverb, but time fears the pyramids. However, the Pyramid of Khufu has lost 20 feet of its height, and all its ancient marble casing is gone. Perhaps time is only leisurely with it. Beside it stands Khafre's pyramid, a trifle smaller, but still capped with the granite casing that once covered it all. Humbly beyond this squats the pyramid of Khafre's successor, Menkaure, the Mycerinus of Herodotus, who reigned from 3011 to 2988 B.C., covered not with granite but with shamefaced brick, as if to announce that when men raised it, the zenith of the old kingdom had passed. The statues of Menkaure that have come down to us show him as a man more refined and less forceful than Khafre. Civilization, like life, destroys what it has perfected. Already, it may be, the growth of comforts and luxuries, the progress of manners and morals had made men lovers of peace and haters of war. Suddenly a new figure appeared, usurped Menkaure's throne, and put an end to the pyramid builders' dynasty. 4. The Middle Kingdom. The Feudal Age, the 12th Dynasty, the Hyksos domination. Kings were never so plentiful as in Egypt. History lumps them into dynasties, monarchs of one line or family, but even then they burden the memory intolerably. One of these early pharaohs, Pepi II, ruled Egypt for 94 years, 2738 to 2644 B.C., the longest reign in history. When he died, anarchy and dissolution ensued, the pharaohs lost control, and feudal barons ruled the nomes independently. This alternation between centralized and decentralized power is one of the cyclical rhythms of history, as if men tired alternately of immoderate liberty and excessive order. After a dark age of 4 chaotic centuries, a strong-willed Charlemagne arose, set things severely in order, changed the capital from Memphis to Thebes, and under the title of Amenemhet I, inaugurated that 12th dynasty, during which all the arts, excepting perhaps architecture, reached a height of excellence never equaled in known Egypt before or again. Through an old inscription, Amenemhet speaks to us. I was one who cultivated grain and loved the harvest god. The Nile greeted me and every valley. None was hungry in my years, none thirsted then. Men dwelt in peace through that which I wrought, and conversed of me. His reward was a conspiracy among the Talleyrans and Fouchés whom he had raised to high office. He put it down with a mighty hand, but left for his son, Polonius-like, a scroll of bitter counsel, an admirable formula for despotism, but a heavy price to pay for royalty. Hearken to that which I say to thee, that thou mayest be king of the earth, that thou mayest increase good. Harden thyself against all subordinates. The people give heed to him who terrorizes them. Approach them not alone. Fill not thy heart with a brother. No, not a friend. When thou sleepest, guard for thyself thine own heart, for a man hath no friend in the day of evil. This stern ruler, who seems to us so human across 4,000 years, established a system of administration that held for half a millennium. Wealth grew again, and then art. Senusret I built a great canal from the Nile to the Red Sea, repelled Nubian invaders, and erected great temples at Heliopolis, Abydos, and Karnak. 10 colossal seated figures of him have cheated time and litter the Cairo Museum. Another Senusret, III, began the subjugation of Palestine, drove back the recurrent Nubians, and raised a stele or slab at the southern frontier, not from any desire that ye should worship it, but that ye should fight for it. Amenemhet III, a great administrator, builder of canals and irrigation, put an end, perhaps too effectively, to the power of the barons and replaced them with appointees of the king. 13 years after his death, Egypt was plunged into disorder by a dispute among rival claimants to the throne, and the Middle Kingdom ended in 2 centuries of turmoil and disruption. Then the Hyksos, nomads from Asia, invaded disunited Egypt, set fire to the cities, razed the temples, squandered the accumulated wealth, destroyed much of the accumulated art, and for 200 years subjected the Nile Valley to the rule of the shepherd kings. Ancient civilizations were little isles in a sea of barbarism, prosperous settlements surrounded by hungry, envious, and warlike hunters and herders. At any moment the wall of defense might be broken down. So the Kassites raided Babylonia, the Gauls attacked Greece and Rome, the Huns overran Italy, the Mongols came down upon Peking. Soon, however, the conquerors in their turn grew fat and prosperous and lost control. The Egyptians rose in a war of liberation, expelled the Hyksos, and established the 18th dynasty, which was to lift Egypt to greater power, wealth, and glory than ever before. 5. The Empire. The Great Queen, Thutmose III, the zenith of Egypt. Perhaps the invasion had brought another rejuvenation by the infusion of fresh blood, but at the same time the new age marked the beginning of a 1,000-year struggle between Egypt and Western Asia. Thutmose I not only consolidated the power of the new empire, but, on the ground that Western Asia must be controlled to prevent further interruptions, invaded Syria, subjugated it from the coast to Carchemish, put it under guard and tribute, and returned to Thebes laden with spoils and the glory that always comes from the killing of men. At the end of his 30-year reign, he raised his daughter Hatshepsut to partnership with him on the throne. For a time, her husband and stepbrother ruled as Thutmose II, and dying, named as his successor Thutmose III, son of Thutmose I, by a concubine. But Hatshepsut set this high-destined youngster aside, assumed full royal powers, and proved herself a king in everything but gender. Even this exception was not conceded by her, since sacred tradition required that every Egyptian ruler should be a son of the great god Ammon. Hatshepsut arranged to be made at once male and divine. A biography was invented for her by which Ammon had descended upon Hatshepsut's mother Amasai in a flood of perfume and light. His attentions had been gratefully received, and on his departure he had announced that Amasai would give birth to a daughter, in whom all the valor and strength of the god would be made manifest on earth. To satisfy the prejudices of her people and perhaps the secret desire of her heart, the great queen had herself represented on the monuments as a bearded and breastless warrior. And though the inscriptions referred to her with the feminine pronoun, they did not hesitate to speak of her as Son of the Sun and Lord of the Two Lands. When she appeared in public, she dressed in male garb and wore a beard. She had a right to determine her own sex, for she became one of the most successful and beneficent of Egypt's many rulers. She maintained internal order without undue tyranny, and external peace without loss. She organized a great expedition to Punt, presumably the eastern coast of Africa, giving new markets to her merchants and new delicacies to her people. She helped to beautify Karnak, raised their 2 majestic obelisks, built at Der el-Bahri, the stately temple which her father had designed, and repaired some of the damage that had been done to older temples by the Hyksos kings. "I have restored that which was in ruins," one of her proud inscriptions tells us. "I have raised up that which was unfinished, since the Asiatics were in the midst of the Northland, overthrowing that which had been made." Finally, she built for herself a secret and ornate tomb among the sand-swept mountains on the western side of the Nile, in what came to be called the Valley of the King's Tombs. Her successors followed her example until some 60 royal sepulchres had been cut into the hills, and the city of the dead began to rival living Thebes in population. The West End in Egyptian cities was the abode of dead aristocrats. To go west meant to die. For 22 years the queen ruled in wisdom and peace. Thutmose III followed with a reign of many wars. Syria took advantage of Hatshepsut's death to revolt. It did not seem likely to the Syrians that Thutmose, a lad of 22, would be able to maintain the empire created by his father. But Thutmose set off in the very year of his accession, marched his army through Kantara and Gaza at 20 miles a day, and confronted the rebel forces at Har Megiddo, that is, Mount Megiddo, a little town so strategically placed between the rival Lebanon ranges on the road from Egypt to the Euphrates that it has been the Armageddon of countless wars from that day to General Allenby's. In the same pass where in 1918 the British defeated the Turks, Thutmose III, 3,397 years before, defeated the Syrians and their allies. Then Thutmose marched victorious through Western Asia, subduing, taxing, and levying tribute, and returned to Thebes in triumph 6 months after his departure. This was the first of 15 campaigns in which the irresistible Thutmose made Egypt master of the Mediterranean world. Not only did he conquer, but he organized. Everywhere he left doughty garrisons and capable governors. The first man in known history to recognize the importance of sea power, he built a fleet that kept the Near East effectively in leash. The spoils that he seized became the foundation of Egyptian art in the period of the empire. The tribute that he drained from Syria gave his people an Epicurean ease and created a new class of artists who filled all Egypt with precious things. We may vaguely estimate the wealth of the new imperial government when we learn that on one occasion the treasury was able to measure out 9,000 pounds of gold and silver alloy. Trade flourished in Thebes as never before. The temples groaned with offerings, and at Karnak the lordly promenade and festival hall rose to the greater glory of king and god. Then the king retired from the battlefield, designed exquisite vases, and gave himself to internal administration. His vizier or prime minister said of him, as tired secretaries were to say of Napoleon, "Lo, his majesty was one who knew what happened, there was nothing of which he was ignorant, he was the god of knowledge in everything, there was no matter that he did not carry out." He passed away after a rule of 32, some say 54 years, having made Egyptian leadership in the Mediterranean world complete. After him another conqueror, Amenhotep II, subdued again certain idolaters of liberty in Syria, and returned to Thebes with 7 captive kings, still alive, hanging head downward from the prow of the imperial galley. 6 of them he sacrificed to Ammon with his own hand. Then another Thutmose, who does not count, and in 1412 Amenhotep III began a long reign in which the accumulated wealth of a century of mastery brought Egypt to the acme of her splendor. A fine bust in the British Museum shows him as a man at once of refinement and of strength, able to hold firmly together the empire bequeathed to him, and yet living in an atmosphere of comfort and elegance that might have been envied by Petronius or the Medici. Only the exhuming of Tutankhamun's relics could make us credit the traditions and records of Amenhotep's riches and luxury. In his reign, Thebes was as majestic as any city in history. Her streets crowded with merchants, her markets filled with the goods of the world, her buildings surpassing in magnificence all those of ancient or modern capitals, her imposing palaces receiving tribute from an endless chain of vassal states, her massive temples enriched all over with gold and adorned with every art, her spacious villas and costly chateaux, her shaded promenades and artificial lakes, providing the scene for sumptuous displays of fashion that anticipated imperial Rome. Such was Egypt's capital in the days of her glory, in the reign before her fall. 3. The civilization of Egypt. 1. Agriculture. Behind these kings and queens were pawns. Behind these temples, palaces, and pyramids were the workers of the cities and the peasants of the fields. The population of Egypt in the 4th century before Christ is estimated at some 7 million souls. Herodotus describes them optimistically as he found them about 450 B.C. They gather in the fruits of the earth with less labor than any other people, for they have not the toil of breaking up the furrow with the plow, nor of hoeing, nor of any other work which all other men must labor at to obtain a crop of corn. But when the river has come of its own accord and irrigated their fields, and having irrigated them has subsided, then each man sows his own land and turns his swine into it. And when the seed has been trodden into it by the swine, he waits for harvest time. Then he gathers it in. As the swine trod in the seed, so apes were tamed and taught to pluck fruit from the trees. And the same Nile that irrigated the fields deposited upon them in its inundation thousands of fish in shallow pools. Even the same net with which the peasant fished during the day was used around his head at night as a double protection against mosquitoes. Nevertheless, it was not he who profited by the bounty of the river. Every acre of the soil belonged to the pharaoh, and other men could use it only by his kind indulgence. Every tiller of the earth had to pay him an annual tax of 10 or 20% in kind. Large tracts were owned by the feudal barons or other wealthy men. The size of some of these estates may be judged from the circumstance that one of them had 1,500 cows. Cereals, fish, and meat were the chief items of diet. One fragment tells the schoolboy what he is permitted to eat. It includes 33 forms of flesh, 48 baked meats, and 24 varieties of drink. The rich washed down their meals with wine, the poor with barley beer. The lot of the peasant was hard. The free farmer was subject only to the middleman and the tax collector, who dealt with him on the most time-honored of economic principles, taking all that the traffic would bear out of the produce of the land. Here is how a complacent contemporary scribe conceived the life of the men who fed ancient Egypt. Dost thou not recall the picture of the farmer when the 10th of his grain is levied? Worms have destroyed half the wheat, and the hippopotami have eaten the rest. There are swarms of rats in the fields. The grasshoppers alight there, the cattle devour, the little birds pilfer, and if the farmer loses sight for an instant of what remains on the ground, it is carried off by robbers. Moreover, the thongs which bind the iron and the hoe are worn out, and the team has died at the plough. It is then that the scribe steps out of the boat at the landing place to levy the tithe. And there come the keepers of the doors of the king's granary with cudgels, and negroes with ribs of palm leaves, crying, "Come now, come!" There is none, and they throw the cultivator full length upon the ground, bind him, drag him to the canal, and fling him in head first. His wife is bound with him, his children are put into chains. The neighbors, in the meantime, leave him and fly to save their grain. It is a characteristic bit of literary exaggeration, but the author might have added that the peasant was subject at any time to the corvée, doing forced labor for the king, dredging the canals, building roads, tilling the royal lands, or dragging great stones and obelisks for pyramids, temples, and palaces. Probably a majority of the laborers in the field were moderately content, accepting their poverty patiently. Many of them were slaves, captured in the wars or bonded for debt. Sometimes slave raids were organized, and women and children from abroad were sold to the highest bidder at home. An old relief in the Leiden Museum pictures a long procession of Asiatic captives passing gloomily into the land of bondage. One sees them still alive on that vivid stone, their hands tied behind their backs or their heads, or thrust through rude handcuffs of wood, their faces empty with the apathy that has known the last despair. 2. Industry. Miners, manufacturers, workers, engineers, transport, postal service, commerce and finance, scribes. Slowly, as the peasants toiled, an economic surplus grew, and food was laid aside for workers in industry and trade. Having no minerals, Egypt sought them in Arabia and Nubia. The great distances offered no temptation to private initiative, and for many centuries mining was a government monopoly. Copper was mined in small quantities, iron was imported from the Hittites, gold mines were found along the eastern coast in Nubia and in every vassal treasury. Diodorus Siculus, 56 B.C., describes Egyptian miners following with lamp and pick the veins of gold in the earth, children carrying up the heavy ore, stone mortars pounding it to bits, old men and women washing the dirt away. We cannot tell to what extent nationalistic exaggeration distorts the famous passage. The kings of Egypt collect condemned prisoners, prisoners of war and others who, beset by false accusations, have been in a fit of anger thrown into prison. These, sometimes alone, sometimes with their entire family, they send to the gold mines, partly to exact a just vengeance for crimes committed by the condemned, partly to secure for themselves a big revenue through their toil. As these workers can take no care of their bodies and have not even a garment to hide their nakedness, there is no one who, seeing these luckless people, would not pity them because of the excess of their misery. For there is no forgiveness or relaxation at all for the sick or the maimed or the old or for woman's weakness, but all with blows are compelled to stick to their labor until, worn out, they die in their servitude. Thus the poor wretches even account the future more dreadful than the present because of the excess of their punishment, and look to death as more desirable than life. In its earliest dynasties, Egypt learned the art of fusing copper with tin to make bronze. First, bronze weapons, swords, helmets, and shields, then bronze tools, wheels, rollers, levers, pulleys, windlasses, wedges, lathes, screws, drills that bored the toughest diorite stone, saws that cut the massive slabs of the sarcophagi. Egyptian workers made brick, cement, and plaster of Paris. They glazed pottery, blew glass, and glorified both with color. They were masters in the carving of wood. They made everything from boats and carriages, chairs and beds, to handsome coffins that almost invited men to die. Out of animal skins they made clothing, quivers, shields, and seats. All the arts of the tanner are pictured on the walls of the tombs, and the curved knives represented there in the tanner's hand are used by cobblers to this day. From the papyrus plant, Egyptian artisans made ropes, mats, sandals, and paper. Other workmen developed the arts of enameling and varnishing and applied chemistry to industry. Still others wove tissues of the subtlest weave in the history of the textile art. Specimens of linen woven 4,000 years ago show today, despite time's corrosion, a weave so fine that it requires a magnifying glass to distinguish it from silk. The best work of the modern machine loom is coarse in comparison with this fabric of the ancient Egyptian hand loom. If, says Peschel, we compare the technical inventory of the Egyptians with our own, it is evident that before the invention of the steam engine we scarcely excelled them in anything. The workers were mostly freemen, partly slaves. In general, every trade was a caste, as in modern India, and sons were expected to follow and take over the occupations of their fathers. The great wars brought in thousands of captives, making possible the large estates and the triumphs of engineering. Ramesses III presented 113,000 slaves to the temples during the course of his reign. The free artisans were usually organized for the specific undertaking by a chief workman or overseer, who sold their labor as a group and paid them individually. A chalk tablet in the British Museum contains a chief workman's record of 43 workers, listing their absences and their causes, ill or sacrificing to the god or just plain lazy. Strikes were frequent. Once, their pay being long overdue, the workmen besieged the overseer and threatened him. "We have been driven here by hunger and thirst," they told him. "We have no clothes, we have no oil, we have no food. Write to our lord the Pharaoh on the subject, and write to the governor of the nome, who is over us, that they may give us something for our sustenance." A Greek tradition reports a great revolt in Egypt in which the slaves captured a province and held it so long that time, which sanctions everything, gave them legal ownership of it. But of this revolt there is no record in Egyptian inscriptions. It is surprising that a civilization so ruthless in its exploitation of labor should have known or recorded so few revolutions. Egyptian engineering was superior to anything known to the Greeks or Romans, or to Europe before the Industrial Revolution. Only our time has excelled it, and we may be mistaken. Senusret III, for example, built a wall 27 miles long to gather into Lake Moeris the waters of the Fayum Basin, thereby reclaiming 25,000 acres of marshland for cultivation and providing a vast reservoir for irrigation. Great canals were constructed, some from the Nile to the Red Sea. The caisson was used for digging, and obelisks weighing 1,000 tons were transported over great distances. If we may credit Herodotus, or judge from later undertakings of the same kind represented in the reliefs of the 18th dynasty, these immense stones were drawn on greased beams by thousands of slaves and raised to the desired level on inclined approaches beginning far away. Machinery was rare because muscle was cheap. See in one relief 800 rowers in 27 boats dragging a barge laden with 2 obelisks. This is the Eden to which our romantic machine wreckers would return. Ships 100 feet long by half 100 feet wide plied the Nile and the Red Sea, and finally sailed the Mediterranean. On land, goods were transported by human muscle, later by donkeys, later by the horse, which probably the Hyksos brought to Egypt. The camel did not appear till Ptolemaic days. The poor man walked or paddled his simple boat. The rich man rode in sedan chairs carried by slaves, or later in chariots clumsily made with the weight placed entirely in front of the axle. There was a regular postal service. An ancient papyrus says, "Write to me by the letter carrier." Communication, however, was difficult. Roads were few and bad, except for the military highway through Gaza to the Euphrates, and the serpentine form of the Nile, which was the main high road of Egypt, doubled the distance from town to town. Trade was comparatively primitive. Most of it was by barter in village bazaars. Foreign commerce grew slowly, restricted severely by the most up-to-date tariff walls. The various kingdoms of the Near East believed strongly in the protective principle, for customs dues were a mainstay of their royal treasuries. Nevertheless, Egypt grew rich by importing raw materials and exporting finished products. Syrian, Cretan, and Cypriot merchants crowded the markets of Egypt, and Phoenician galleys sailed up the Nile to the busy wharves of Thebes. Coinage had not yet developed. Payments, even of the highest salaries, were made in goods: corn, bread, yeast, beer, etc. Taxes were collected in kind, and the pharaoh's treasuries were not a mint of money, but storehouses of 1,000 products from the fields and shops. After the influx of precious metals that followed the conquests of Thutmose III, merchants began to pay for goods with rings or ingots of gold, measured by weight at every transaction. But no coins of definite value guaranteed by the state arose to facilitate exchange. Credit, however, was highly developed. Written transfers frequently took the place of barter or payment. Scribes were busy everywhere, accelerating business with legal documents of exchange, accounting, and finance. Every visitor to the Louvre has seen the statue of the Egyptian scribe, squatting on his haunches, almost completely nude, dressed with a pen behind the ears reserved for the one he holds in his hand. He keeps record of work done and goods paid, of prices and costs, of profits and loss. He counts the cattle as they move to the slaughter, or corn as it is measured out in sale. He draws up contracts and wills, and makes out his master's income tax. Verily, there is nothing new under the sun. He is sedulously attentive and mechanically industrious. He has just enough intelligence not to be dangerous. His life is monotonous, but he consoles himself by writing essays on the hardships of the manual worker's existence and the princely dignity of those whose food is paper and whose blood is ink. 3. Government. The bureaucrats, law, the vizier, the pharaoh. With these scribes as a clerical bureaucracy, the pharaoh and the provincial nobles maintained law and order in the state. Ancient slabs show such clerks taking the census and examining income tax returns. Through nilometers that measured the rise of the river, the scribe officials forecast the size of the harvest and estimated the government's future revenue. They allotted appropriations in advance to governmental departments, supervised industry and trade, and in some measure achieved, almost at the outset of history, a planned economy regulated by the state. Civil and criminal legislation were highly developed, and already in the Fifth Dynasty the law of private property and bequest was intricate and precise. As in our own days, there was absolute equality before the law, whenever the contesting parties had equal resources and influence. The oldest legal document in the world is a brief in the British Museum, presenting to the court a complex case in inheritance. Judges required cases to be pled and answered, re-argued and rebutted, not in oratory but in writing, which compares favorably with our windy litigation. Perjury was punished with death. There were regular courts, rising from local judgment seats in the nomes to supreme courts at Memphis, Thebes, or Heliopolis. Torture was used occasionally as a midwife to truth. Beating with a rod was a frequent punishment. Mutilation by cutting off nose or ears, hand or tongue was sometimes resorted to, or exile to the mines, or death by strangling, impaling, beheading, or burning at the stake. The extreme penalty was to be embalmed alive, to be eaten slowly by an inescapable coating of corrosive natron. Criminals of high rank were saved the shame of public execution by being permitted to kill themselves, as in samurai Japan. We find no signs of any system of police. Even the standing army, always small because of Egypt's protected isolation between deserts and seas, was seldom used for internal discipline. Security of life and property and the continuity of law and government rested almost entirely on the prestige of the pharaoh, maintained by the schools and the church. No other nation except China has ever dared to depend so largely upon psychological discipline. It was a well-organized government with a better record of duration than any other in history. At the head of the administration was the vizier, who served at once as prime minister, chief justice, and head of the treasury. He was the court of last resort under the pharaoh himself. A tomb relief shows us the vizier leaving his house early in the morning to hear the petitions of the poor, to hear, as the inscription reads, what the people say in their demands, and to make no distinction between small and great. A remarkable papyrus roll, which comes down to us from the days of the empire, purports to be the form of address, perhaps it is but a literary invention, with which the pharaoh installed a new vizier. Look to the office of the vizier. Be watchful over all that is done therein. Behold, it is the established support of the whole land. The vizierate is not sweet, it is bitter. Behold, it is not to show respect of persons to princes and counselors. It is not to make for himself slaves of any people. Behold, when a petitioner comes from Upper or Lower Egypt, see thou to it that everything is done in accordance with law, that everything is done according to the custom thereof, giving to every man his right. It is an abomination of the god to show partiality. Look upon him who is known to thee like him who is unknown to thee, and him who is near the king like him who is far from his house. Behold, a prince who does this, he shall endure here in this place. The dread of a prince is that he does justice. Behold the regulation that is laid upon thee. The pharaoh himself was the supreme court. Any case might, under certain circumstances, be brought to him if the plaintiff was careless of expense. Ancient carvings show us the great house from which he ruled, and in which the offices of the government were gathered. From this great house, which the Egyptians called Pharaoh, and which the Jews translated Pharaoh, came the title of the emperor. Here he carried on an arduous routine of executive work, sometimes with a schedule as rigorous as Chandragupta's, Louis XIV's, or Napoleon's. When he traveled, the nobles met him at the feudal frontiers, escorted and entertained him, and gave him presents proportionate to their expectations. One lord, says a proud inscription, gave to Amenhotep II carriages of silver and gold, statues of ivory and ebony, jewels, weapons, and works of art, 680 shields, 140 bronze daggers, and many vases of precious metal. The pharaoh reciprocated by taking one of the baron's sons to live with him at court, a subtle way of exacting a hostage of fidelity. The oldest of the courtiers constituted a council of elders called Saru, or the Great Ones, who served as an advisory cabinet to the king. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.